The story of the Kennedy family did not begin with tragedy, bloodshed, or gunshots that shook history. It began with a quiet yet fierce ambition, one nurtured over years of observation, endurance, and an unwillingness to accept fate. Before the name Kennedy became a symbol of political power and America's collective grief, it stood for assent, for the belief that a family could rewrite its own place in history. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. was born into an America still rigidly divided by class. As an Irish Catholic, he grew up in a society where the doors of power remained firmly closed to those outside the traditional Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. This discrimination was not always spoken aloud, but it revealed itself in refusals, in guarded glances, and in invisible boundaries that Joseph Kennedy recognized early on. From that awareness, his ambition took shape, not merely to become wealthy, but to break the unspoken order that governed American society. Joseph Kennedy did not believe in luck. He believed in calculation, discipline, and control over the future. With sharp business instincts, he rapidly amassed a vast fortune through banking, real estate, the stock market, and even the fledgling film industry of Hollywood. Yet unlike many tycoons of his era, he did not see money as the final goal. For him, wealth was a tool. Political power was the true objective. Family, in Joseph Kennedy's vision, was not simply a private refuge. It was a long-term project. He married Rose Fitzgerald, the daughter of a prominent Boston politician, not only out of affection, but also because of their alignment in social standing, religious faith, and shared ambition. That marriage laid the foundation for a political dynasty planned from a very early stage. Their 9 children were raised in an environment where success was not a choice, but an obligation. Catholicism permeated family life, bringing with it discipline, endurance, and the belief that suffering was an inevitable part of a greater mission. In the Kennedy household, failure was not romanticized, weakness was not encouraged, and excellence was demanded with strict resolve. Joseph Kennedy believed America needed new leaders, young, intelligent, and unbound by outdated privileges. He believed his sons could become those leaders. From the family dinner table to summer vacations, conversations revolved around politics, war, honor, and civic duty. The Kennedy children's childhoods passed through unofficial lessons in power and influence. The eldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was chosen as the heir to this dream. He embodied everything his father desired: strength, confidence, leadership potential, and unwavering certainty about the path ahead. But history rarely follows human plans. When Joseph Kennedy Jr. was killed in World War II, the family's dream of power did not collapse, it shifted. That loss was more than personal grief. It was the first sign of the cost of ambition. From that moment on, the other sons, especially John Fitzgerald Kennedy, were thrust into roles for which they had never been fully prepared. The dream of power remained, but it now carried the shadows of sacrifice, destiny, and irreversible choices. The Kennedy dynasty was born from a profound belief in controlling the future. Yet that very belief, when combined with the glare of public attention and the harsh realities of American politics, planted the seeds of a chain of tragedies no one in the family could foresee. The rest of the story will reveal that when power reaches its peak, the price is rarely paid all at once, but slowly, silently, and without mercy. If power was Joseph P. Kennedy's greatest ambition, then family was the machine he designed to achieve it. Within the expansive walls of the Kennedy estates from Boston to Hyannisport, the atmosphere was both that of a large, bustling household and of an unofficial training academy for those destined to step onto the stage of history. Love existed there, but it always walked hand in hand with expectation. Care was inseparable from supervision. And childhood, though materially abundant, was rarely truly carefree. Joseph and Rose Kennedy raised their children under a system of discipline rarely seen even among elite families. Catholicism was not merely a personal faith. It was a moral pillar that governed every aspect of life. Every church service, every prayer, every lesson on sacrifice and endurance was repeated as part of the family's identity. For Rose Kennedy, faith was the anchor that kept the family steady amid her husband's relentless ambition. For the children, faith gradually became a framework they were required to adapt to, whether they wished to or not. In the Kennedy household, there was no such thing as ordinary. Each child was constantly reminded that they carried a special name and that the name demanded special responsibility. Sports, academics, public speaking, political debate, all were continuous trials. Victory was expected. Failure was remembered. And comparison among siblings was unavoidable in a family where achievement became the measure of worth. The father rarely showed tenderness. Joseph Kennedy expressed affection through investment, direction, and pressure. He observed his children like a strategist, identifying strengths and weaknesses, quietly assigning roles to each of them. Approval from their father was the greatest reward, and also the hardest to attain. That dynamic created powerful motivation, but it also planted a persistent anxiety, the fear of never being good enough. Rose Kennedy, by contrast, was the emotional pillar of the family, but in her own distinctive way. She believed discipline and emotional control were signs of virtue. Pain was not to be displayed. Tears were not encouraged. Even in the face of loss, Rose maintained an almost icy composure, believing that silent endurance was the path to moral elevation. For her children, this was both a source of strength and a form of emotional distance that was difficult to name. Behind the image of the model family lay personal sacrifices that were rarely acknowledged. Kathleen Kennedy, the most vibrant and free-spirited daughter, often felt out of place amid rigid rules. Rosemary Kennedy, who had intellectual disabilities, became a painful secret the family tried to conceal in an era deeply intolerant of difference. The controversial medical decision made about Rosemary not only altered her life forever, but also left a profound moral fracture in the family's history. For the sons, pressure took the form of duty. Service to the nation was not a choice, it was a predetermined destiny. War, politics, and national honor were discussed in the Kennedy household as inevitable trials a man must face. Yet behind the confident smiles and stirring rhetoric were young men carrying fear, doubt, and a longing to live lives less tightly scripted. Ultimately, the Kennedy family was not devoid of love. But it was a conditional love, expressed through expectation and achievement. That environment produced extraordinary individuals, yet also made them deeply vulnerable to failure, scandal, and loss. Before they became powerful figures on the American political stage, they were children growing up in the immense shadow of a collective dream. And when family becomes the foundation of power, even the smallest personal cracks are eventually magnified under public scrutiny. What was planted within the private life of the Kennedy family would gradually reveal its consequences, not behind closed doors, but on the historical stage of an entire nation. Among all of Joseph P. Kennedy's children, Joseph Kennedy Jr. was the clearest embodiment of the power-driven dream his father had nurtured his entire life. From a very young age, Joe Jr. was implicitly designated as the heir. He carried the look of a future leader, tall, confident, intelligent, and ambitious. In his father's eyes, Joe Jr. was not merely the eldest son. He was the promise that the Kennedy family would one day reach the pinnacle of American political power. Joseph P. Kennedy believed history was waiting for his son. He invested everything in Joe Jr., an elite education at prestigious institutions, rigorous shaping of his political thinking, diplomatic outlook, and sense of patriotism. Within the family, Joe Jr. became the unspoken benchmark against which the other siblings were measured. He did not need to prove himself as the successor. That role had already been all but decided. But the world beyond the Kennedy household did not operate according to anyone's plans. When World War II broke out, Joe Jr. did not hesitate to choose military service. For him, war was not only a national duty, but a test of honor. He wanted to prove that he deserved the expectations placed upon him not with words, but through action. Joe Jr. joined the United States Navy and was soon assigned to dangerous missions. For Joseph P. Kennedy, every letter from the front carried pride mixed with anxiety. He trusted his son's abilities, yet he also understood that war was a place with no room for privilege or pedigree. Still, deep down, he believed destiny would protect the chosen one. In 1944, Joe Jr. volunteered for a top-secret mission, one of the most dangerous operations of the time. It was not a compulsory order, but a voluntary decision driven by a sense of responsibility and a desire to serve. In that moment, Joe Jr. was no longer the heir of a powerful dynasty. He was simply a young pilot facing an uncertain sky. The explosion over the skies of England ended Joe Jr.'s life in an instant. There was no farewell, no chance to turn back. The news struck the Kennedy family like a direct blow to the heart of the dream Joseph P. Kennedy had built over decades. The son in whom he had placed all his hopes, the one he believed would one day enter the White House, was gone before his political journey had even begun. Joe Jr.'s death was not merely a personal loss. It was the collapse of a grand design. In that moment, the internal order of the Kennedy family was overturned. Fate changed course, not by choice, but through tragedy. The other children, especially John F. Kennedy, were suddenly thrust into roles they had never been fully prepared to carry. Joseph P. Kennedy, the man who believed he could control the future through strategy and willpower, confronted the limits of power for the first time. His grief was not publicly displayed, but the silence that followed Joe Jr.'s death spoke volumes. From that point on, in the Kennedy family, success and tragedy became inseparably intertwined, two sides of the same destiny. The death of Joseph Kennedy Jr. was the first sign of the devastating price of ambition. It opened the door to a chain of losses no one in the family could have foreseen. And from here on, the story of the Kennedy dynasty would no longer be only a story of rising power, but a haunting journey of people repeatedly tested by history through suffering and loss. Before becoming the youngest elected president in American history, before his deep voice echoed through some of the most tense moments of the Cold War, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was once just a thin, frail boy who often stood on the margins of his own family. Unlike his strong, confident older brother Joseph Kennedy Jr., John, called Jack by those close to him, grew up surrounded by illness, physical fragility, and a lingering sense that he was not fate's first choice. John F. Kennedy's childhood was marked by hospitals, medications, and prolonged pain. Doctors once doubted that he would even survive into adulthood. Chronic intestinal problems, severe back pain, and a weakened immune system confined him repeatedly to bed, forcing him to watch life pass by from a distance. In a family that prized strength and achievement, such frailty was not only a physical burden, but a profound psychological challenge. Yet it was precisely in this isolation that John Kennedy developed a rich inner world. He read relentlessly history, philosophy, politics, and literature. When his body could not keep pace with his siblings, his intellect became the space where he found freedom. Over time, John learned to observe people closely, to listen to the complexities of power, and to understand that leadership does not arise solely from strength, but from empathy and insight. The death of Joseph Kennedy Jr. completely altered the course of John's life. The son, once seen as a secondary option, suddenly became the family's sole hope for carrying forward its political dream. This responsibility arrived not in triumph, but in grief and uncertainty. Even Joseph P. Kennedy himself questioned whether John, with his fragile health, could endure the harsh path ahead. John F. Kennedy neither rebelled against fate nor surrendered to it. He chose to confront it. During World War II, despite his weak physical condition, he joined the United States Navy. The sinking of the PT-109 became a defining moment in John Kennedy's public image. Seriously injured and in excruciating pain, he nevertheless led his surviving crew through hours of peril at sea. That act was more than courage. It was a quiet declaration that he was no longer the weak boy of his past. After the war, John entered politics with a distinctly different presence. He was not loud or flamboyant, but carried a rare calmness and depth. On the campaign trail, he spoke of responsibility, of a new generation, and of an America that needed to be led by intelligence and moral clarity, not brute force. Gradually, the public embraced John F. Kennedy as a symbol of hope and renewal. When he became the 35th President of the United States, Americans saw in him more than a leader. They saw a revival of national confidence. A man who had faced death early in life, who had lived with constant physical pain, now stood at the most powerful position in the world, carrying the message that human beings can transcend their own limitations. John F. Kennedy did not hide his fragility, but he refused to let it define him. It was this very combination of vulnerability and resolve that made him a singular figure in American history. An imperfect president, yet profoundly human. A leader who understood that leadership is not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite knowing the cost may be great. And from that image, the faith of an entire nation was ignited, though no one yet knew that the light would soon be extinguished by tragedy. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, America was not merely witnessing an inauguration, it was witnessing the birth of a legend. The media quickly labeled his presidency Camelot, borrowing the image of a mythical kingdom where ideals, courage, and faith in the future coexisted. It was a poetic name, but also a thin veil over a period that was both radiant and deeply conflicted. John and Jacqueline Kennedy became a power couple with cinematic allure. A young, intelligent president spoke of global responsibility and the dream of conquering space. A refined First Lady, deeply versed in the arts, transformed the White House into a new cultural center of America. Receptions, concerts, and art exhibitions unfolded in an atmosphere of elegance, making citizens feel that their nation was entering a civilized, modern, and confident era. Camelot was not just an image, it was an emotion. In the shadow of the Cold War, America longed for a symbol it could believe in. John F. Kennedy fulfilled that need through inspiring language and a message about a new generation unafraid to sacrifice for freedom. His speeches, especially his call for citizens to serve their country, ignited a profound sense of pride in millions of Americans. Yet behind the glow of that idealism, power was never simple. The Kennedy White House was a place of heavy decisions, of constant tension between ideals and reality. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, miscalculations in foreign policy, and mounting pressure from the Soviet Union stripped Camelot of its innocence. Every decision carried the risk of pushing the world to the brink of war. Within the Kennedy family itself, cracks began to appear in the perfect facade. John F. Kennedy's health remained a carefully guarded secret. Debilitating back pain, dependence on medication, and chronic exhaustion were hidden from public view. To the nation, he embodied vitality and youth. To himself, he was still a man fighting daily just to keep his body functioning. Camelot was also a place where power and private life collided dangerously. Personal relationships and secrets kept for political survival gradually widened the gap between the public image and the private reality. The Kennedy family understood that to preserve the myth, they had to sacrifice privacy and sometimes even complete honesty with themselves. Still, in the eyes of the public, Camelot remained an era of hope. Americans saw in the White House a future where intellect, art, and morality could coexist. They believed their country was being led by a generation unburdened by the past, ready to face the world with confidence and humanity. But history is often cruel to beautiful dreams. It was precisely Camelot's romance that made its eventual collapse all the more painful. When the light shines too brightly, the shadows behind it grow deeper. And though no one realized it at the time, Camelot was not only the peak of the Kennedy family's power, it was also its most fragile moment, revealing that every legend is built upon the vulnerable foundation of human beings. The glow of Camelot was not created by ideals and eloquent words alone, but also by a sophisticated system of information control, where political power, private life, and the media were tightly interwoven. Behind the closed doors of the White House, the Kennedy family understood clearly that to preserve a flawless public image, they had to conceal anything that did not fit the legend they were carefully constructing. John F. Kennedy entered the presidency, carrying a burden unknown to the voters. His health was far more serious than what was publicly disclosed. Chronic back pain, Addison's disease, and a dependence on painkillers and stimulants were kept strictly secret. In an era when leadership was inseparable from strength and stability, such truths could have shaken the nation's confidence. For that reason, the Kennedy family and their inner circle chose silence as a strategy of political survival. John F. Kennedy's private life was also a morally risky gray zone. Extramarital relationships, while not uncommon among the powerful at the time, posed a potentially fatal vulnerability in the context of the Cold War. A single secret exposed at the wrong moment could become leverage for blackmail or a propaganda weapon in the hands of adversaries. As a result, the machinery protecting the president's image operated not only within politics, but extended deep into the press and even the entertainment world. American media in the early 1960s functioned under an unspoken code. Journalists knew more than they reported. They noticed irregularities, heard whispered rumors, yet chose silence out of a belief that national stability outweighed exposing the president's private life. It was a period when the boundary between journalistic responsibility and political loyalty became dangerously blurred. Robert Kennedy, John's younger brother and Attorney General, played a pivotal role in containing potential threats. He did not merely defend his brother against political opponents, but also shielded him from risks arising from the White House's own lifestyle. Absolute family loyalty within the Kennedy clan was both a source of strength and a force that gradually isolated them within a world of secrets and constant tension. Politics under the Kennedy administration was far from the purity reflected in its public image. Quiet compromises, decisions made in the shadows, and complex relationships with other centers of power revealed a colder reality. To maintain global leadership, ideals sometimes had to yield to strategy, and morality was pressured by the fear of failure. The coexistence of two parallel images, a president who inspired the public and a deeply conflicted man behind the scenes, created a persistent undercurrent of unease. Camelot, no matter how radiant, was built on a fragile foundation of concealment. And the more secrets that were kept, the more dangerous the hidden cost became. Those secrets threatened not only John F. Kennedy as an individual, but placed the entire Kennedy family in a vulnerable position. When power relies too heavily on image, even the smallest crack can be enough to bring the whole structure down. And history, as we shall see, never misses the chance to expose what people try hardest to keep hidden. November 22nd, 1963, began like an ordinary morning on a political tour. The sky over Dallas was clear, the air filled with the optimism of a southern city welcoming the President of the United States. No one in the crowds waving along the streets could have imagined that they were standing on the threshold of a moment that would forever divide American history into two parts, before Dallas and after. John F. Kennedy sat in the open-top limousine beside Jacqueline Kennedy, who wore an elegant pink suit. Bathed in sunlight and smiles, the image became the final embodiment of Camelot, a young, confident president, close to the people, with no bulletproof glass separating him from them. It was an expression of trust, but also of vulnerability. As the motorcade entered Dealey Plaza, time seemed to slow. Gunshots rang out sharp, brief, and merciless. In a matter of seconds, the world changed. John F. Kennedy collapsed, Jacqueline panicked, and the crowd shifted from excitement to horror. There was no warning, no chance to react, only the stunned silence that follows sudden violence. The news spread at a staggering speed. Across the United States, families gathered around television sets, listening to fragmented reports, unable to believe what they were hearing. When the president's death was confirmed, a sense of emptiness swept across the nation, not only because a leader had been lost, but because a symbol of hope, of a promised future, had vanished. For the Kennedy family, Dallas was not merely a political tragedy. It was the most devastating blow to the heart of the dynasty they had built. Jacqueline Kennedy, in a moment of indescribable grief, became the most haunting image of that day. Her uncanny composure, the blood-stained suit, and her vacant stare were seared into the collective memory of humanity. The entire world watched John F. Kennedy's funeral as a ritual that mourned not just a man, but an era. The slow procession, the muffled drums, and the image of a small boy saluting his father's coffin became enduring symbols of shared sorrow. America wept not out of weakness, but from the realization that even the greatest dreams could be shattered in an instant. The assassination did more than take John F. Kennedy's life. It planted a deep and lasting seed of doubt in American society. Questions about the assassin, the motive, and the truth behind the gunshots became wounds that never fully healed. Trust in institutions, in security, and in power itself began to fracture. Dallas, 1963, marked the moment America lost its political innocence. From then on, power was no longer viewed through a romantic lens. It came hand in hand with fear, suspicion, and the awareness that history can change course in a single fleeting moment. For the Kennedy family, this tragedy was not the end, but the beginning of a long chain of losses. Camelot collapsed, yet its echoes continued to reverberate, a reminder that power and destiny always walk together, and that the price to be paid can far exceed anything human calculation can foresee. After Dallas, the Kennedy family was no longer a symbol of brilliance and glamour, but a family bearing an open wound before the eyes of the world. In the void left by John F. Kennedy, one name gradually stepped out of his brother's shadow: Robert Francis Kennedy. not with the radiant confidence of Camelot, but with grief, anger, and a resolve forged in loss. Robert Kennedy Bobby had never been drawn to the spotlight. During his years in the White House, he was known as the loyal, sharp-minded younger brother, at times even coldly relentless. But John's death transformed him profoundly. Political sharpness gave way to moral anguish. Power, in Robert Kennedy's eyes, was no longer an end in itself, but a tool to repair a world he believed had gone terribly astray. He left his post as Attorney General and entered the Senate with a markedly different voice. Robert Kennedy spoke of the poor, of racial injustice, of the Vietnam War, and the moral cost America was paying. He went into slums, listened to voices long ignored, and gradually became a symbol of an America yearning for change. To many, Bobby was the continuation of John's spirit, yet deeper, more wounded, and more grounded in harsh reality. When Robert Kennedy announced his presidential candidacy in 1968, hope was ignited once again. In a nation torn apart by violence, war, and hatred, he represented the possibility of healing. His speeches were not theatrical. They were heavy with reflection. He spoke of shared pain, collective responsibility, and the need for America to confront itself honestly. But like his brother before him, Robert Kennedy entered a perilous political landscape. The powerful support he received was matched by fierce hostility. To extremists, he was a threat. To conservative forces, he was a symbol of instability. And in a country already accustomed to political violence, hope once again became a target. On the night of June 5, 1968, in Los Angeles, just after winning the California primary, Robert Kennedy was shot. The news spread like a familiar nightmare. America had not yet healed from Dallas when it was dragged back into the same old pain. When Robert Kennedy died, the prevailing feeling was no longer shock, but despair, as if history were repeating itself with cruel insistence, denying both the Kennedy family and the nation a second chance. Robert Kennedy's death extinguished the dream of renewal. It reinforced the dark belief that idealism in America must be paid for in blood. For the Kennedy family, this was no longer a personal tragedy, but a historical curse. Two brothers, two symbols, two hopes, both ended in violence. Robert Kennedy died before he could carry out what he believed was necessary. Yet his legacy does not lie in the power he attained, but in the question he left behind. Can a society endure if its ideals are continually crushed by hatred? And can America learn anything from repeatedly losing those who seek to change it? After the gunshots in Dallas and Los Angeles, America began to look at the Kennedy family through a different lens. They were no longer seen only as a dynasty of power and tragedy, but gradually became associated with a heavier idea, the Kennedy curse. It was not a scientific concept, but a collective feeling formed when too many deaths, accidents, and losses occurred within a single family, stretching across generations. The tragedy did not end with John and Robert. In 1969, Edward Kennedy, the youngest surviving brother, was involved in a car accident at Chappaquiddick that resulted in the death of a young woman. Although Ted Kennedy survived and continued his political career, his moral image was permanently shadowed. To the public, this was not merely an accident, but evidence that power could conceal wrongdoing, yet could never erase its psychological and ethical consequences. In the years that followed, tragedy continued to haunt the next generation. The children of Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy grew up under the immense pressure of a name that was both glorious and dangerous. Plane crashes, drug overdoses, sudden deaths, and lives cut short appeared with such frequency that the public could not help but ask, was this merely a string of painful coincidences, or the inevitable outcome of living too long beneath the glare of power. Within the Kennedy family, fame was never a shield. It was a burden. Those who bore the Kennedy name grew up feeling they belonged to history before they had a chance to become themselves. Every mistake was magnified. Every personal tragedy became a national story. That pressure, silent yet relentless, was enough to warp the destiny of any human being. If the Kennedy curse exists, it is not a supernatural spell, but the consequence of a life pushed to extremes. Power brings opportunity, but it also carries risk. Wealth opens doors, yet distances people from ordinary safety and restraint. When combined with enormous public expectations, it creates an environment where danger becomes normalized. The American public, searching for meaning in repeated loss, assigned the Kennedy family a dark destiny. But behind the idea of a curse are flesh and blood human beings with fear, flaws, and a desire to live ordinary lives. The real question is not whether the curse exists, but whether a person can ever escape the shadow of the power they themselves pursue. The deaths and accidents within the Kennedy family forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power does not only create heroes, it also crushes people. It amplifies every emotion, every choice, and every consequence. In the case of the Kennedys, history seems to repeatedly remind us that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, stands outside the reach of tragedy. The rest of the story lies not in decoding the curse, but in how the Kennedy family and America itself learned to live with it, with memory, with loss, and with questions that may never have definitive answers. When the final funeral drums faded, when the breaking news became archival footage, the Kennedy family remained no longer as a rising dynasty of power, but as a living memory embedded in the American consciousness. Their legacy cannot be measured by the number of terms served, laws passed, or political victories won. It exists in the questions history has left behind, in emotions that have never been fully laid to rest. The Kennedy family once embodied a distinctly American dream, the belief that one's origins do not determine one's destiny, that intelligence, discipline, and ambition can lift a person beyond class barriers, religion, and prejudice. Joseph P. Kennedy believed in that idea, and by every means available to him, he turned that belief into reality. But when the dream was pushed to the pinnacle of power, it began to reveal the harsh cost embedded within it. John F. Kennedy left behind the image of a president of hope of calls to rise above fear and look toward the future. Robert Kennedy left a legacy of conscience, of striving to heal a deeply divided society. Other members of the family, whether successful or fallen, lived under the shadow of a name heavy with historical weight. For them, Kennedy was not merely a surname, but a responsibility, an expectation, an unending comparison. That legacy also forced America to look inward. Assassinations, political violence, and successive tragedies shook faith in the safety of democratic power. The Kennedys were not only victims of history, but a mirror reflecting America's deepest contradictions between ideals and reality, between morality and ambition, between hope and fear. Some view the Kennedy family as tragic heroes, crushed by the very ideals they pursued. Others see them with skepticism, believing that power blurred moral boundaries and led to unavoidable consequences. Both perspectives coexist because the Kennedy legacy is neither simple nor pure, and it cannot be confined to a single judgment. Perhaps the most important question the Kennedy family leaves behind is not who was right or wrong, nor whether a curse truly existed. The question runs deeper. Can human beings pursue power without losing themselves? Can a society honor ideals without turning people into symbols, and then accepting their sacrifice as inevitable? Time has passed, yet the image of Camelot still lives in the collective memory, not as a complete historical truth, but as a metaphor. A brief era when America believed it could be better, more humane, more courageous. And because it ended too soon, it became immortal. The Kennedy legacy does not lie in answers, but in its ability to compel future generations to keep asking questions about power, about responsibility, about the cost of ambition, and about the human beings behind the legends history creates. That is why, even after many decades, the name Kennedy has never truly left the flow of American history.